Hey guys, today I bring you an in-depth guide to Citrine, her abilities, and I'll explain how you can make Citrine completely broken. This guide will cover all you need to know in great detail, so feel free to use the chapters to navigate around or watch this video in multiple sessions, as this will be quite a long one. Hope you enjoy. Citrine got released alongside the Mirror Defense game mode, which you can find on Tiana Pass on Mars. This defense mission took the original defense concept and overhauled it by merging in the game mode Void Flood. In Mirror Defense, you are stimulated to collect floating crystal fragments, something that can easily be done with a Titania or a Wukong in your squad. The release of Mirror Defense and Citrine parts being only available in Rotation C was met with a lot of criticism from the player base, as estimations predicted it could take up to 60 hours to acquire an entire Citrine set. However, this update also introduced an alternative method to obtain Citrine and her signature weapons by collecting crystal fragments and turning these in with OTAC in a Necrolisk in exchange for parts. This luckily removed some of the RNG and reduced the grind. In total, an entire Citrine set will set you down 1550 Rania crystal fragments and 1500 Belric crystal fragments. But after you obtain Citrine, you can indulge in her status-driven power fantasy. To make sure you understand exactly how broken Citrine is, I will explain in depth all of her abilities and her passive. First, let's start off with her passive. Her passive is pretty straightforward. It provides up to 25 health regen per second based on the picked up health orbs, which increase it by 0.1 from the 5 health per second base value. Citrine's first ability is called Fractured Blast. This ability will shoot out crystal fragments within 14 meters, scaling with ability range, that tag enemies with a special type of effect, indicated by a crystal above their heads. This ability will also inflict a damage over time bleed. Enemies affected by the crystal effect will drop increased health and energy orbs. The bleed damage as well as the orb drop chance are scaled by modding for ability strength. If the drop percentages for the orbs are modded to reach above 100%, one guaranteed orb will drop, with the remaining chance above 100 being able to trigger a double drop. Citrine, modded for a decent amount of ability strength, can easily litter the ground with health and energy orbs, which makes the following mods and arcanes worth considering. First, there's Arcane Blessing, which increases your max health on health or pickup. Then you have Arcane Energize, to overload on your energy, which is not really needed. Then we have Arcane Pulse, for extra health to you and the rest of your squad, including companions. And finally, there's the non-meta but very fun option of Arcane Eruption. This is still quite a good choice, as combined with a slow effect like Gloom, it's able to completely stun lock your opposition. For mods, you can think of the health and energy conversion mods, which either add armor or give you extra ability strength per picked up health orb or energy orb, respectively. Health conversion could then work nicely with the newer Arcane Battery to free up a mod slot on your build, as you can drop flow. But the most straightforward and best option is to use Equilibrium, as this mod will allow you to keep both health and energy completely topped up. It's also worth mentioning that her first ability is her Helminth ability, meaning you can enable easy energy economy on any frame you put this ability on, as long as you mod for high ability strength. Now let's move on to her second ability, which has a special interaction giving you some insane damage reduction, but I will get to that later. Her second ability, Preserving Shell, grants 40% damage reduction at base, scaling up to 90% based on the kills or assists made by Citrine. If your modded ability strength is 225% or above, damage reduction will immediately start off at 90%. However, damage reduction will also decay over time if no kills or assists are made within a 1 second time period. There's two different decay rates based on how high your damage reduction is. Between 25 and 75% damage reduction, decay rate will be 1% per second, but between 75 and 90% damage reduction, it will be 3% per second. Range of this ability is not scaled by range mods, but instead is based on your affinity range, which is always set to a base 50 meters. However, affinity range can be increased in a couple of different ways. First, you can use the Vesrin Focus School, which increases the range by up to 25 meters. But you can also make use of a very special type of consumable called Phosphor, which should not be mistaken for Phosphor, which you can use for Arcane Dissolution. Phosphor items come from Rakak in Cetus and can be crafted with resources from the Plains of Eidolon. Both of these phosphors that you can get can be stacked on top of each other, granting an absurd 200 meter increase to affinity range per item, for a total 400 meter increase to affinity range. The phosphor effect will only last for 2 minutes, but crafting phosphors will give you 20 uses per craft. Visualizing this increase shows how insanely large this range is, but also shows you how pointless it is in normal tile sets where you will never need this kind of affinity range, unless your squad is running around like headless chickens. The final things worth noting is that multiple Citrines in a squad can stack the Preserving Shell bonus multiplicatively, and Preserving Shell affects both health and shields. Stacking up to 4 Citrines in your squad can net you with a 99.99% damage reduction. You can further stack this by using Citrine Specters that are also able to cast Preserving Shell. An additional 4 Specters will have a theoretical damage reduction limit of 99.999999%. If you want to go even crazier, you can also add another Ancient Healer Specter for 90%, Mirage's Eclipse for 75%, and Adaptation for 90% damage reduction. All of this together will net you a 99.9999999975% damage reduction. My god, I think I've just turned German. Anyway, at this point you can take 200 billion damage, and you want to know how much damage you actually take? Only 5 damage. 5 damage. This is why Citrine's second ability cannot just be a bit nuts, but the full nuts, if stacked with multiple Citrines in your squad. Okay, now having covered her second ability, let's look at her third, Prismatic Gem. Casting this ability will actually cause 97% of my viewers who aren't subscribed to the channel to subscribe for more helpful Warframe content coming their way. So hereby, I cast Prismatic Gem, and you can do me a favor by hitting that subscribe button. But now for real, where Preserving Shell gave Citrine some insane damage reduction potential, her Prismatic Gem is where Citrine gets her broken power. Prismatic Gem is able to apply the 4 basic elemental types to enemies, which are Toxin, Heat, Cold, and Electric. This makes Citrine an opportune contender for equipping Archon mods, especially Archon Stretch and Archon Continuity. Archon Stretch will give you a basically permanent 2 energy per second, while Archon Continuity will give you corrosive as a 5th innate status type. This can be combined with 2 Emerald Archon shards for full armor strip at 14 corrosive stacks, and will work great for any of the condition overload mods on your weapons. Besides proccing these statuses, the gem also provides an increase to status chance on your weapons and an increase to status duration, which both stack additively with other status chance or status duration mods. Status chance increases will scale with ability strength, whereas status duration scales with ability duration. These increases will be given to any ally within the crystal's range. Speaking about the range, Prismatic Gem has a 15 meter base range, which can be scaled with range mods. However, the actual beam shot by the crystal is not based on this range. Instead, if you shoot any enemy while you are standing within the 15 meter range around the crystal, the beam will reach beyond this point to target the enemies which are shot by you, your allies, or even your companions. This means that as long as you are in the range of the crystal, the beam of the crystal has infinite range. And the beam is not limited by line of sight requirement. The beam has a 0.4 second internal targeting cooldown, so it will shoot a beam every 0.4 seconds. Multiple beams can be generated per ally that damages an enemy. This 0.4 second internal cooldown is then applied per ally that's shooting, so you can have multiple beams active. With a full Spectre squad, you can produce an insane disco ball of beams. Beam weapons will make sure that a single target is hit multiple times in quick succession, making sentinel weapons like the Verglass a great option to build up a high amount of status damage on a single target. A quite funny and broken interaction takes place with duplex bonds, as newly spawned copies of your sentinel can also produce their own beams, and they can be buffed by using Roar. This also works for any spawned Spectres or crewmates, which reminds me that if you haven't checked out my recent Spectre video, make sure you do. It gives a great introduction to Spectres if you've never used them before. Special weapons like the Azima or the Zenistar are also able to passively target enemies with beams, but either you need to be within range of the gem yourself, or the deployables that spawn from these weapons need to target enemies within the gem's range. As before, multiple Citrines can stack the buffs of Prismatic Gem on top of each other, but compared to Preserving Shell, they will be additive to each other and not multiplicative. Now it's time to move on to her final ability, Crystallize. Crystallize will send out a wave of crystals in a 190-degree vision cone with a 30-meter base range, scaled by ability range. Once the wave reaches enemies, it will spawn crystals on them and inflict some light impact damage, scaling with ability strength. You can target the crystals on enemies to give you a flat 300% critical chance increase, meaning that you will get guaranteed red crits. However, it's a final stat, which means that any other sources of crit will not stack on top of it, except for the Vigilante mod set that can increase hits to a tier 4 crit. There are also some oddities with the vision cone, particularly when you cast Crystallize looking straight up or straight down. This will change the radius of the ability from the 190 degrees to a full 360 degrees for some reason, allowing you to crystallize targets behind you. It's important to note that crystals will also spawn on Eximus units. The weapons that will benefit from Crystallize the most are weapons with low innate crit chance and a high base damage or a high crit multiplier, and they should be hit scan based, since there is a hidden stat that only gives hit scan weapons a ×2 critical damage multiplier on top of the set 300% critical chance. Good weapon options include the Breton and Burston Incarnon, as these are hit scan. If you choose to keep Crystallize on your build, I would recommend you mod for 0 crit chance, but with high crit damage, and if you can squeeze it in your build, some status chance and status damage. Crystallize can become a breeze to use with the augment mod called Recrystallize. This augment mod will cause the spread of crystals upon kills made by shooting crystals on enemies. This will happen in a 16-meter radius that scales with ability range. This means that you can pretty much cast Crystallize once and never have to recast it again if your range and enemy density is high enough. Looking at Citrine's total kit, there's a couple of takeaways. First, Citrine functions great for weapons that have multiplicative overload scaling, since she's able to prime a large number of targets with at least 4 different status effects all the time. The second thing is that weapons with high crit multipliers but low crit chance, like the Kuva Nukor, or weapons with high base damage but low crit chance, can benefit greatly from Crystallize. And finally, the new status vulnerability and status damage stats that we are getting more and more of on mods as well as abilities can go absolutely nuts on Citrine due to her sheer amount of status applied. With this knowledge now in your hands, let's get to the builds I've cooked up. Make sure to stick around for the absolutely broken Damagecap build that's also coming up. The first build I want to share is a standard Recrystallized Citrine that can function as a weapons platform. This build will function as a base build for the other ones coming up, where it's mainly the weapons and the helmet ability that will change. I use a good mix of strength, range and duration for all of her abilities, and because her 1 generates a ton of energy, we are able to drop the efficiency on this build with blind rage. Equilibrium is pretty much a must include in any of the Citrine builds. If I'm pushing enemy levels up to around 1500, health tanking with Arcane Blessing feels pretty smooth. I also went with Mold Augmented, but on the Crystallized build, you can also swap these out for any other arcanes of your choice. As this is a weapons platform build, you can choose the weapons that you want to run yourself, as most of them will benefit greatly from the innate red crits you get from the crystals. For this specific build, there are no Archon shard requirements. I would just advise 1 yellow shard for casting speed, and you could possibly consider running 2 emerald ones for full armor strip. Now, for the second build I have, this is a bit more specific and also utilizes some more synergies. In this build, I utilize the status buffing that Citrine provides with her Prismatic gem for massive AoE status damage through the use of the Hate Incarnon with the new mod Burning Hate. Using this mod enables the activation of a 120% status vulnerability on enemies for any further applied status effects. To trigger this, the Hate has to hit targets that are affected by fire proc, which will be the case 99% of the time when you attack enemies within range of your Prismatic gem. Furthermore, this 120% is multiplicative to both the Elementalist mod and to any faction damage mods. Even better is that the effect can be spread through the use of melee influence in a 20-meter radius. The benefit of Prismatic Gem cannot be understated in this build, as the combination of Voltaic Strike, Galvanized Elementalist, and Prismatic Gem gives the Hate a 100% status chance, even if you pick the base crit chance option on the final Incarnon evolution. In the end, the Hate build looks like this. Still built for high crit damage, alongside status damage spreading through melee influence. For the Incarnon perks, I chose the perks that do not require you to equip the other Stalker weapons, but you can feel free to do so if you want. The final evolution will be the base crit chance, as I said earlier. Your primary and secondary don't really matter for this build, except that I'd recommend at least using 1 Dexterity Arcane to keep your combo multiplier up more easily. Now, in the next step, this build will get even more powerful. You see, Status spreading is one thing, but status nuking is even better. Besides using the status damage from the hate, I'm also using the mecha set for massive 30-meter status nukes every 15 seconds. To do this, you can equip any choice of Kubro, but I would recommend a Ura's Kubro with the following build for the Kubro itself and for its claws. The Citrine build in this case will be as follows. The base of the build is still very similar to the first one, with some mods changed out for the mecha set mods. In this build, I'm also using Roar to further increase the status damage. For the Archon shards, I can recommend again 1 yellow one for casting speed, 2 emeralds for armor strip, and 2 violet ones for melee crit damage. Okay, so here we are at the third build, where it's now time to break Warframe. As with the previous build, this build will focus on status damage, but not in the same way as before. In this build, I will show you how you can get Toxin procs up to 60 million and deal into the billions of damage, often even reaching Damagecap. For this build, the Citrine setup won't change as much, as you can see. However, as this build is able to easily scale its damage to level cap enemies, the survivability strategy will shift from health tanking to shield gating. This also means that for this build you can consider taking off Preserving Shell and keeping Crystallize for the additional crit chance. Besides this, the Arcane slot for Arcane Blessing now also opens up, where I chose to run Arcane Fury. In this build, you will see a great harmony between different pieces. First, for the companion, I use Nautilus with Verglass. On Nautilus, I use Contagious Bond as well as Duplex Bond, which will trigger additional crystal beams, as I've explained before. On the Verglass, I mod for Toxin damage and Magnetic. This is because the Magnetic status effect can proc electric procs that are based off of the enemy's total HP, which will be crazy large towards level cap. The Toxin damage is chosen because I use 2 Emerald Archon shards, increasing my Toxin damage procs. The pièce de la résistance will come in the form of Harmony with Melee Afflictions. Melee Afflictions has some odd scaling when paired with the Elementalist mod, faction mods, and the Toxin damage from Toxin damage shards. I will not get into the full nitty-gritty of this, since this video is not about Melee Afflictions, but if you want to learn more about Melee Afflictions, I would recommend videos from my fellow YouTubers Emalistic and Arthas. Links in the description. The only thing that you need to know for now is that heavy slams are able to proc the lifted status type, which is able to apply Melee Affliction. For Toxin damage, additional stacks applied to the target will scale based off the weapon's status damage, faction damage, Toxin mods, as well as the Toxin damage on the Archon shard. Now, slamming with the Harmony may make you think that all previously applied status effects will be consumed before you trigger new ones, but this actually happens the other way around. Instead, you will add newly skilled status damage procs onto your target, which will further increase the damage, after which they are all condensed and dealt as a single damage instance. By stacking up insane amounts of status procs through the use of Verglass and multiple Sentinels, from Duplex Bond, you can condense all of this damage into one massive damage instance, instantly killing almost every enemy. For the Harmony build, I'd advise the one shown on screen, which also uses the new Galvanized Reflex to uphold a free 5x combo multiplier, further scaling the damage. Now, besides Harmony, there's another contender to use with Melee Afflictions, and that is the Sampotes. While the lifted effect cannot always be applied to enemies, the Ragdoll status effect will always apply Melee Affliction. And my gosh, would you look at that? It happens to be that the Sampotes will force proc Ragdolls on slams and heavy slams. This means that you can apply insane scaling Toxin procs on all enemies that you hit with your slams. For the Sampotes, I would advise the following build, which is centered around heavy attack slams. For this build, the primary will not really matter. But for the secondary, I would advise a primer like the Epitaph Prime with secondary Encumber to trigger even more status effects and apply viral to enemies for even further scaling of damage. Now, the annoying part is that priming and slamming with your melee don't go fully hand in hand, as you will need to swap to your melee all the time. The quickest way to go from priming to slamming is by cancelling some of the animations, which I do in the following order. First, I prime the enemies by shooting my Epitaph in this case. Then I use the melee button to instantly bring out my melee. And right after this, I cast my first ability. Then I jump and I'm able to perform the heavy slam. If you do this in quick succession, it will look like follows. Once you master this build with Citrine, there is nothing that can stand in your way. The next two final builds are relatively short and will be more towards the meme side of things. The first build is mostly for a bit of a meme interaction between Breach Surge and the Prismatic Gem, as these abilities will reinforce each other to deal damage to enemies. This will practically enable you to go semi-AFK, especially in normal star chart missions where the levels are a lot lower. The only thing you have to do is cast your gem, cast Breach Surge, sit back, relax, and watch the damage go. For this build, the Citrine setup looks like this. where I switched back to health tanking with Arcane Blessing, and I put in Vigorous Swap, as this increases the damage of Breach Surge multiplicatively. So make sure that while you are watching the numbers go up, you stay swapping your weapons. This build is nicely paired with the Uras Kubro from before, as they will give you stealth while you can just stand there and cast your abilities. The second Mimi build is one with Gloom and Arcane Eruption, a combination that I mentioned earlier. This completely locks down all enemies in smaller tile sets. Because we can get a ridiculous amount of energy orbs from our first ability, Arcane Eruption will constantly trigger. Combined with the slow effect from Gloom, it will mean that enemies will be spending more time on their ass as they will be shooting you, at least as long as you keep up the energy orbs that are coming in. This build does not really have that much functionality, apart from being potentially quite handy for interception missions, as there is no kill requirement and crowd control is still king. Mostly. The final thing I want to discuss is Specter considerations across all of the builds. For the builds today, I have two top picks for Specters, which are, surprise surprise, the Dante Specter, as always, but for these builds specifically, it's because the Dante Specter is able to provide another source of status damage. Besides the Dante Specter, I could also recommend a second Citrine Specter if you are playing solo, because, as I mentioned, all of Citrine's abilities, including her passive, will stack on top of each other, giving you extra damage reduction and increased status chance and status duration. Okay, phew. This brings me to the end of this insanely long in-depth Citrine guide. This one took me a lot of time, so please, if you are so kind, leave me a like. Also subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I would highly appreciate it if you share this to your fellow tenno. With that, I would like to thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye. As always, thanks to all channel members for supporting the channel. If you are looking to become a member, please find the join button below the video.